All right, in this video, we're going to talk about the basics of Augustine's life. I debated whether to even do this video since you are reading a very in-depth biography, but then I figured I could lay out some of the big events here just in case someone opted not to do the reading, not that that ever happens in any of my classes. Or this can also be a quick reference guide since I'll be talking about kind of the big things here. Okay, so the basics of Augustine's biography. Augustine was born in the year 354 in what is now Algeria in North Africa. Up on the screen, I have a map showing where the city is and then a picture of the city now. Augustine's mother was named Monica. She was a devout Christian. She is a main character in his Confessions, so you'll get to know her pretty well. She was a bit of a meddler, I'm not going to lie, but the two had a good relationship, and he very obviously loved her dearly. That cannot be said for his father. His name was Patrick or Patricius. Augustine doesn't say too much about him, and you get the impression that maybe Patrick wasn't the best husband or father. Patrick eventually does become a Christian, though he was a pagan through most of his life. He was a Roman official of some sort. We know that Augustine had siblings, at least an older brother, since Augustine did not inherit his family's property. It is obvious from a young age that Augustine was brilliant. His parents were comfortable, but they were not wealthy, but they did get him the best education they possibly could with the intention that he would go on to an impressive career in rhetoric. Rhetoric would have been the appropriate field for being a lawyer, for example. Okay, so Augustine first studied in his hometown, then he went to Carthage. Augustine became a teacher of rhetoric, again, first in his hometown, and then he went to Rome, and then he went to Milan. Really, he was looking for better students, which I think is pretty funny. When in Carthage, he met a woman and fell in love. I want to take a minute to explain the situation because she's usually just referred to as his concubine, which is technically true, but it also is a little dismissive of the relationship. Roman marriage laws were really, really restrictive, and concubinage was an actual legal relationship status for a couple that would have offered her some legal protections. They were obviously of different social classes, which is why they couldn't marry. The two had a monogamous relationship for about 15 years. They had a son together pretty early in their relationship, who Augustine writes about with great, great affection. Unfortunately, the child died when he was a teenager, maybe 15, 16. Regarding Augustine's relationship with this woman, it was always expected that he would eventually marry somebody of a similar or a higher social class. Monica wanted to arrange a marriage to an heiress, which she eventually did accomplish after Augustine gained a level of prestige within his career. Once the marriage was contracted, the girl's family, and I do mean girl here, okay, upper class girls were married in their early teenage years. She was only 12 years old when this marriage was contracted, okay, but her family demanded that Augustine's lover be sent away, and so she was. In one of the more poetic moments in Confessions, Augustine writes, "The woman with whom I had habitually slept was torn away from my side because she was a hindrance to my marriage. My heart, which was deeply attached, was cut and wounded and left a trail of blood." Augustine is one of those few saints who also gives us a tragic love story. Anyway, Augustine's marriage never happened. All right, so the marriage was contracted when the girl was about 12. It wasn't to happen until she was about 14. And in that 2 years, Augustine converted to Christianity, decided he wanted to live a celibate life, and ended the engagement. Okay, so let's talk a minute about this conversion. His Confessions really lays out his spiritual journey, so you will get a firsthand account of that. First, he becomes a Manichaean, and he did that for about 8 years until he became disillusioned with it. Now, if you remember from History 1, there's 2 levels of Manichaeans. There was the elect, they were vegetarians, they were celibate, and then there were the hearers. Augustine always stayed in that kind of secondary role of a hearer. All right, and then after he left the Manichaeans, he became a Neoplatonist. And you will see this Platonic influence through his work, and that's not unusual for the time. Lots of theologians heavily used Plato. Okay, in effect, you can kind of see this period of Neoplatonism as a gateway to Christianity in a sense. And while he was in Milan, he does convert in this real like mystical moment in a garden. Augustine was baptized at the age of 33 by Ambrose of Milan. This is actually pretty funny. Augustine's mother really wanted Ambrose to mentor him, but Ambrose didn't have the time or the desire to do so. Ambrose is a pretty interesting figure in his own right. He was elected bishop while still a catechumen. He was an incredibly influential bishop in a powerful city. He was really a busy guy. He was a well-respected theologian. He was skilled in both Latin and Greek, and he translated a number of the Greek fathers into Latin. Augustine was not particularly skilled at Greek. He knew a little bit, but he was not fluent in it by any means. But he was a much more creative and thoughtful theologian than Ambrose was, truthfully. But my point here is that people often emphasize Ambrose's influence on Augustine, but I actually think it was rather limited. Following his baptism, Augustine sets out for his native town where he wants to pursue a monastic lifestyle with other men who had likewise experienced radical conversions to the Christian faith. On the journey at the port of Ostia, outside of Rome, they get stuck. Okay, it's like a blockade. And Monica becomes very sick and dies suddenly, but happy that her son completely committed to Christ and the church. All right, but he describes this moment where the two of them share a mystical experience together right before she dies. That's a really nice moment in Confessions. You'll find the moment in Book 9, Section 10, paragraph 23. So just make note of it when you get to that in the book. And Augustine does take up a monastic life in Tagaste, but after a few years, he was called to become a priest, which he really did not want. It's kind of funny. He was avoiding cities where he knew bishops were because he didn't want to be ordained. But he eventually is forced to become a priest. He's forced to become the assistant to the bishop. And when he's ordained, rather unexpectedly, he starts to cry because he does not want to be a priest. And everyone misinterprets these tears of his. They think that he's upset that he wasn't immediately made bishop. At the time, bishops were the only ones allowed to preach, or primarily the ones who preached. But Augustine was directed to preach. He was an excellent public speaker. And so they wanted him out there preaching and debating issues of theology. So in Hippo, he establishes another monastic community, which he directed while assisting the bishop, whose name was Valerius. Several years later, Augustine succeeded Valerius as the head of the diocese, as bishop. And so he has to move into the bishop's house. And so he doesn't want to disturb the peace of the monastic community. So he actually writes a rule, the Augustinian rule. The Dominicans use this rule to this day, all right, to kind of continue to offer direction to them. And then he establishes yet a third monastic community for clerics at his new episcopal residence. Thus, from the time he returns to North Africa to his death, Augustine is always in a monastic community. As a bishop, Augustine found his desired life of contemplation and separation from the world was basically impossible. Okay, he has so many obligations as a bishop, as a leader of the local church, and as a civil official. All right. And those civil issues were really a part of being a bishop at this time. For example, a bishop was expected to defend their parishioners in court. So you can see how his skills in rhetoric were really important for this part of his job. So he was such a busy individual. He was also very, very pastoral. You can see this in a number of his writings. You can read this in the Enchiridion, which you'll read, which is really meant as a guide for believers. It's very readable. And I think it's one of the better pieces that you'll read this semester. You'll also see it in his sermons. If you happen to be in the Luther Seminary Library, you can head down to the 3rd floor in the stacks, and we have a ton of his writings. Not everything, but a lot of them. And there are whole books of sermons of his that you can read. In addition to his pastoral duties in Hippo, he traveled to church councils in the region of North Africa. He went to like 40 or 50 different, times over the course of his 35 years as bishop. And then through his life, he produced over 200 books, nearly 1,000 sermons, and then letters and other works as well. In the year 430, Augustine fell ill. As he lay dying, the city was attacked by the Vandals, and both his life and really Roman North Africa slipped away at roughly the same time. All right, that's it on his life for now. Thanks, everybody.